The second plenary session titled Collective Memory or Collective Future will now begin. Mr. Stevens from Financial Times will be moderating the session. Mr. Stevens, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Much looking forward to this session. As you'll see, it's called Collective Memory and Collective or Collective Future. Perhaps we'll discover you can combine the two. Now, of course, if one thinks about collective memory, it's part of the fabric of our lives. Our communities, our nations are built around collective memories. Collective memory, in a way, is a cement for many of our nations, and a benign cement. And you can also think of collective memories of terrible events, and anyone who's spent any time in Germany will have seen how Germany keeps alive the memory of the Holocaust to inform the present and to remind people where fascism, dictatorship can take you if you're not careful. The problem with collective memory comes when it becomes an excuse to sustain grievances, real and perceived, into the present, and to drag them up and to use them as a source of nationalism and xenophobia and of conflict today as well as yesterday. And that, I think, is at least at the heart of the problem we want to address in this session. Everyone who follows this part of the world will have seen how heavy sometimes the weight of history sometimes is. We heard this morning about the failure of Japan and the Republic of Korea, sometimes to come to terms with their history. We in Europe, rather smugly, thought we'd abolished history, and that we, with Franco-German reconciliation after the Second World War, had put all that behind us. We've discovered more recently, as nationalisms have risen across the continent, that that's not the case, and history in Hungary, in Poland, and elsewhere is being dragged out again as an excuse to foster and reignite old conflicts. So we've got a brilliant panel here. I'm not going to go through their CVs because you can read them all. We're going to start off with Alexandra. Now, she's given me permission not to give her full second name, so I'm going to call her Alexandra Grabia. If you look at the first part of that name, you'll understand why. Who's with the Polish Academy of Sciences and is principal investigator in the memory laws in European and comparative perspectives. Volker Stanzel, who many of you will know, very experienced German diplomat in this region and beyond, now vice president of the German Council on Foreign Relations. David Harris is chief executive officer of the American Jewish Committee and has been extremely active in the last 25 years, I think, in dealing with many of the problems of history that we'll be talking about. And finally, we have someone on their debut as a panelist. We thought that Dr. Harb should sing for his supper, we sometimes say in England. So he's going to join us as our last panelist, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of the tensions in this part of the world. But I'm going to start with Alexandra and just give us a perspective about what's happening in Europe now, and in Poland in particular, but is this part of a more general trend?
Well, in the area of collective memory, I think that all choices are difficult and consequential. So perhaps at first I will share some remarks on how not to deal with the past, and in particular how not to deal with the past with the tools of law. But let me start with a quote, with a powerful quote. In 1987, Jan Błoński, the author of a very moving essay, Poor Poles Looking at the Jewish Ghetto, referring to the Holocaust, in his great wisdom, captured the essence of coming to terms with the past and of asking for forgiveness and also of forgiving. And I quote, "Genocide of which the Polish people were not guilty happened after all on our soil and stigmatized this soil forever. We are obliged to carry this past inside us, irrespective of how painful it might be. On this graveyard, this obligation really boils down to a respect for one thing, to see our past in truth." And the recent wave of legislation enacted in Poland, but also in other countries, including many Eastern Central European countries, that invokes the past in the service of ideology and nationalism is actually very contradictory to the very message and behind the words of Jan Błoński. And one of the most telling examples of such legislation is, of course, the famous or infamous Polish Holocaust Bill, the law introduced in January 2018, that introduced penalization of the defamation of the good name of the Polish state and Polish nation by claiming the responsibility of the Polish nation and the Polish state for crimes committed by the German Nazis during the Second World War. And although the very idea of opposing the revision or falsification of history is very valid, and in fact this was the official reason given by the Polish government in order to justify this legislation, the structure of this very law allowed for bringing to court with the penalty of up to 3 years imprisonment. So bringing to court those who dared to challenge the official version of Polish great past and heroic vision of this past. And in regard, in particular in regard to the Polish-Jewish relations and the crimes committed by Poles against the Jews during the Second World War, like Jedwabne pogrom, the pogrom that happened in 1941, July 1941, in a small town of Jedwabne in the eastern part of Poland, where Polish neighbors burned their Jewish neighbors alive in a barn, more than 300 of them. The historical fact that is being nowadays more and more often and more officially contested, even by some state officials. And even though, because of the pressure by the Israelis and the US, and also thanks to the involvement of such organizations as American Jewish Committee, the criminal law sanctions were canceled, and what we are now left with are only civil law sanctions that actually that are introduced in this law in order also to punish for the defamation of the good name of the Polish state and nation, but without these criminal law sanctions. Well, I still think that this law is extremely dangerous tool of bringing a chilling effect to free speech, including academic freedom, but also strengthening the feeling of national pride and community, but understood very narrowly and actually limited to just one religiously, nationally, and ethnically homogeneous group. And I think I will start here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Volker, no country has done more than Germany, I think, to address its past with candor and vigor, and continues to do so. How has it done that, and why is it we're seeing elsewhere, at least in Europe and in the rise of the AfD in Germany, some of these demons from Europe's past beginning to rise again.
Philip, you're trying to open a trap here for a German to praise his own country. Let me first...
No, I'm praising Germany.
Thank
I'm
you.
not
Yes.
asking you to.
So I
I've
won't-
spent time living in
I won't-
Germany, and
I
I've seen it, and I'm...
I won't follow that way then.
No, I'm
but
not,
let's-
not
let-
asking you. I'm asking you about the thinking behind it.
First, let me thank Asan for having me here at this exciting event and to ask me to speak about this truly not irrelevant subject. I think many of you have watched with mirth and wonder when President Trump visited Hanoi that there was so very little talk about a controversy between these two countries, which would have been natural considering the Vietnam War. It just didn't happen. And it has not happened very much in the past decades. Less may have watched what's been going on between the Serbs and the Kosovars. That goes back to 1378 or so, when the Kosovars drove the Serbs, beat them in battle, drove them out of today's Kosovo. And since then, the Serbs say, this is ours, we need to get it back, possibly with blood, which is what Milosevic tried to do in the 1990s, many hundred years after the original event. I think if anything, that illustrates tremendously well the fluidity of our memory. And why is it so fluid? Because it undergoes so many, it has so much impact that it is exposed to. Whatever happens to me loses its authenticity the very moment it happens, because I try to grasp it, understand it, even though I don't verbalize it in the first moment. But of course I try that later when I relate it to others, others again relate it to others, and so on. So our own narrative takes the shape, and that of others, of my story also takes on its own shape. Plus, the more emotionally charged an event is, the stronger the impact of that narrative is. And that is true for joyous events, if we talk about Germany, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and for painful events as well. And it's also true for both the victims and the perpetrators, who also suffer a kind of, very different kind, obviously, of trauma. Just read the statements by the guards of concentration camps at the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt in 1963 and the following years, and you will be shocked by their banality, but at the same time, I think it becomes profoundly clear how right Nietzsche was with this famous saying, I did this, my memory says, I cannot have done this, my pride says, in the end my memory gives in. Now, that is if you only talk about a single person. If you have atrocities committed by or suffered by whole communities, if it's a family or if it's a nation, of course this is even more powerful, and the memory is even more fluid, because each individual has their own narrative, and all these become woven together, painted differently. And the retrospective significance of these traumatic moments can make for an overwhelming dominance in the lives of whole communities. Think of the Serbs. So all this is extremely complex, and at some point all these narratives become something like a collective memory field. Now, fields can be plowed, and memory fields can be worked on, so that the fruit become tangible tools in politics. However, it's completely unpredictable in which way, because memory is fluid, can be manipulated. Politics is something that you negotiate this way or other, you adapt opportunistically. So obviously this can vary, and the same person, very same person who yesterday said Kosovo is ours forever, tomorrow, as Vukovic, president of Serbia, says, next day he may propose land swap, whatever. To possess such a powerful tool as a strongly emotionally charged collective memory field is a temptation for any leader, democratic or not, to manipulate it. Actually, we all manipulate our own memory fields in our personal lives. But Orwell has put this very well when he said, who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. I guess I'll get back to that later on, because there are several ways in which you can manipulate this for the positive. In the end of this very general statement, I only want to open up a perspective on, I think, a very positive element here, if you think about our ethical obligation to come to reconciliation from whichever situation our communities are in. And that is something that is defining the human condition. It is hope. We work hard because we hope to live better. We work even harder if we hope our children can live better. Hope is an enormously strong driver that brings about also reconciliation, because we hope for not only to keep our collective memory maintained as it is, we also hope for a collective future which is better than the present one. And that is extremely important also for politicians to make use of. If we speak about Germany's choice or Korea's choice, I think here is a lever. Thank you.
Thank you. Volker, just before we move on, can I just ask you one question? Why is it, do you think, that it's quite recently, it's in the last 10 or 15 years, that you've seen countries try and disinter some of these memories and rewrite some of the history? So you see it obviously in Hungary, for example, where they've tried to, where the government's tried to rewrite its own role in the Second World War, but also reach back to the grievances, going back to the sort of the breaking up of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and trying to build those grievances and talking about the wider Hungarian nation. Why is there a trigger that drives, do you think?
I think this is extremely interesting to observe, and the reason is in something I said. First, collective memory fields, like personal memories, are fluid. They can be manipulated easily, and thus they become a tool for people in power to use those tools in order to promote their own interests. That is what we observe presently in many countries, where
so they become a tool of populists, sort of demagogues.
These kind of traumata are unturned and then turned into instruments of power politics.
Okay. David Harris, just on Europe, still just for a moment, we've seen a pretty alarming, I think, rise in anti-Semitism in many parts of Europe in the last 5, 10, 15 years. In parts of Eastern Europe, but also in Western Europe, and I'm sad to say in my own country, on the left, in Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. What's stirring this?
Well, first of all, allow me also to thank the Asan Institute for the privilege of being here with this distinguished panel. And before attempting to answer the question, Philip, allow me to say two personal things. Number one, on the subject of collective memory, for those of you familiar with the Jewish calendar, this is the holiday of Passover. And it's during the holiday of Passover, an event that occurred 3,000 years ago, according to Jewish history, with the exodus of Jews from Egypt. We are commanded as Jews in every generation to act as if we were once slaves in Egypt. We are also warned that in every generation there will be someone who will rise up against the Jewish people. So if you're looking for Exhibit A of collective memory, both its possibilities and its paralysis, and secondly, I certainly cannot speak for the biographies of the others on the panel, but Philip, I'm the child of 2 Holocaust survivors. I'm the first person in my entire extended family born in the United States. And everyone in my family older than me, beginning with my parents, was directly touched by the Holocaust. So the issue of how to grapple with these matters is not simply academic or professional, it's very personal. And since I know this conversation is really, in essence, about Korea and Japan, however it's framed. I want to offer 3 examples along a continuum that may have relevance. The first is Germany. As was discussed, for us, as Jews, I believe, Germany offers the best example of public reckoning with its past. But it didn't simply happen in and of itself. It required a strong, visionary, pragmatic leader. And in this case, his name was Konrad Adenauer. And in 1951, 2 years after the German state was born or reborn, he took it upon himself to speak about the, quote, unspeakable crimes, unquote, committed by Germany against the Jewish people, and the need for the German people to come to terms with that. The German people were not all behind Konrad Adenauer. There were many, many, many differences and disputes within Germany about this stance, but courageously he stood his ground and he stayed the course. But that too was not enough, because he needed a partner on the other side who would accept his outstretched hand. And if we're looking for a second example of leadership in this respect, it came from the first Israeli Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, who, though representing a people who was exterminated in such large numbers, slowly came to terms with the reality that Germany had reemerged and that there were pragmatic reasons for Israel to engage with the Germany post-1949. But even in Israel, he faced demonstrations, protests, some violent, led by a name you'll know, Menachem Begin. Nonetheless, Ben-Gurion stayed the course, and together they forged a partnership with Adenauer. The second example moves us, if you will, down the continuum to Austria. Austria, which was totally complicit in the crimes of the Nazi era, and yet until the early 1990s, in other words, nearly 50 years after the war, continued to hide behind the Moscow Declaration of 1943 that labeled Austria the first victim nation. They were comfortable in that setting. And it was only in the early 90s that, again, pragmatic leadership stood up and said, we're going to say what's unpopular but necessary, beginning with Franz Vranitzky, the chancellor then, and continuing to this day in the person of Chancellor Sebastian Kurz. And the third example, for those who may think that time alone is the solution, Volker gave one example of Kosovo and the Serbs. I will offer another example, and that is the Armenian genocide. We are now 104 years after the Armenian genocide, and yet the Turkish leadership continues to adamantly refuse to recognize the Armenian genocide. I think many of you are familiar with the argument, and I bring this to the attention of this session because for those who believe that time and the passing of generations will ipso facto calm the waters and solve the issues, they will not. And the Armenian, Ottoman, Turkish story, I think, is a case in point. As to the anti-Semitism of today in Europe and, frankly, beyond Europe, including now in the United States, for us, we began to see this phenomenon in the years 2000, 2001, and we saw 3 main sources of it, Philip. And in presenting those 3 sources, we understood that we had an additional challenge, not just of waking up people, but of depoliticizing the analysis of anti-Semitism. Because when we spoke about the anti-Semitism of the left, Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party, those on the right were thrilled to embrace the theory, but they were less inclined to self-examine. And conversely, when you spoke to the left about the neo-Nazi populist far right, they were thrilled to embrace, but they were very reluctant to self-examine. And then the far left also was tiptoeing on the third source, which was jihadist anti-Semitism. All 3 have reemerged in Europe. Depending on the country, One is more threatening than the other, but all three have reemerged. And when people ask why, I have to answer by asking the question, why anti-Semitism in the first place? Why has this age-old pathology been allowed to reinvent itself time and again in religious terms, in racial terms, in social terms, in political terms, because it presents convenient scapegoating theories to explain far more complex issues. But I hope we'll have time to get into that later. I don't want to abuse my privilege as an opening speaker.
Chabong. And it's not just about Japan and South Korea. I mean, there are other memories. If you go to China, you'll find some memories. What is it, 100 years of humiliation to be but anyway.
Thank you. I was sitting here and trying to figure out why it is that I volunteered for this particular panel as my debut panel. My motivation for wanting to engage this issue was actually very much my own effort to try to understand and try to also to explain to others South Korea's policy towards North Korea, policy towards Japan, and a policy towards China, for instance, and the United States. So the real motivation was a very policy oriented one, and to me, no amount of trying to explain the dynamics between South Korea and North Korea, between South Korea, Japan, and South Korea and the United States, for instance, based upon international relations theory, based upon balance of power theories, all the other national security interest, they don't seem to be able to really explain what it is, why it is that South Korean policy towards these other countries and towards North Korea are the way they are. And it seemed to me that you really have to, that this is one of those examples of how collective memory of Koreans, what it means to be South Korean or Korean, how that actually, it actually directly informs something like our foreign policy. And that's basically the link that I was trying to establish. But as Philip, you mentioned, this region is still very much about history. And let me give you an example. One of the most striking scenes for me was when Donald Trump had his first summit meeting with Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago. I don't know how many non-Koreans noticed this particular news, which was that after his first meeting with Xi Jinping, Donald Trump came out and said that I just had a sort of a 20-minute or 30-minute history lesson from Xi Jinping, and I just learned that Korea had always been part of China. And so it's obvious that history also informs Mr. Xi Jinping's foreign policy, or at least the way he looks at the region, and especially the way he looks at Korea. If you look at it from that perspective, for instance, one of the topics that came, or issues that came out in our first session too, the Chinese foreign policy called the new type of great power relations. Now, I always try to tell my Chinese colleagues that's one of the worst named foreign policies that I've ever heard, because in Chinese it says, 新型大国关系, 新형대국관계 in Korean, right? The Korean pronunciation of the Chinese classics, and the term there, 大国, 대국. And somebody had, I think, who was it? somebody brought up the whole issue of tributary state this morning in their first session, right? And Evelyn, I think, brought this up. And the term itself is completely loaded, right? When you say great power, okay, that's I don't know, that's like Bismarck and things like that in the Western context, but my goodness, in the Asian context, when you say Daguo, Taiguo, it just means the Qing Chinese Mandarin, the overlord, you know. And so it just seems to me that history over-informs the way we conduct foreign policy, at least, you know, amongst the Asians, it seems, who share the Chinese classical heritage and at least the written language of it. Now, the funny part about that Xi Jinping's comment was that there was very little blowback from South Korea. It was reported in the Korean press, but there was very little reaction amongst the Koreans. And so, for me, the interesting question is, and I actually posed this to my Korean students and whoever, I said, imagine that this was Prime Minister Abe, who just came out with his first summit meeting with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump comes out and says, I just had a 30-minute history lesson from Prime Minister Abe, who just told me that, well, in the 6th century, Japan used to rule southern part of the Korean peninsula, which is what Japanese historians claim. Now, if that statement had been made, I think, I don't know. I think something would have happened to the Japanese embassy here, and I would even venture a couple of Koreans brave enough, they braved their way to Tsushima Island and planted the Korean flag there, and claiming that it's our island, etc. So the collective, the way these things work, is already, as Volker said, it's extremely selective. And it's extremely politicized, and there's just no getting away from it. And so, if we try to understand just how politicized it is, then we actually can start to understand some of the dynamics, foreign policy, international relations of this region. To put it really very simplistically, so let me just go back to, okay, the two Koreas, China on the one hand and Japan. Now, South Korea, Republic of Korea, when it was founded in 1948, there were two powerful ideologies that supported, that there were two ideological pillars of what turns out to be Republic of Korea. One was anti-communism, because the country was split in half. The northern half was communist, and we were not. And so we said that, okay, communists were taking over half of the country. And of course, even before the Korean War, the idea was that we have to take back the half of the country from this communist expansion and takeover. The other part was anti-Japanese nationalism, obviously, because we were Japan's colony for 35 years. Now, those two ideologies, at first, didn't seem to, at the height of the Cold War, didn't seem to matter. In fact, they seemed to go pretty well. That is why, at the height of the Cold War, our relationship with Japan, because it was fighting, common cause against communism, and the Japanese, even the Japanese right, of course, were more than willing to, of course, endorse our position in terms of when it comes to fighting communism, etc. But once the Cold War ended, and Korean nationalism begins to take bite, that anti-Japanese sentiment and anti-communist sentiment started to clash. So if you want national reconciliation between the two Koreas, if you're pushing for a sunshine policy, if you're saying that this horrendous history of fratricidal war, we need to put this behind us, and some kind of national reconciliation has to take place, that means that anti-communism has to go. And besides, the Cold War has ended, so why do we have to keep doing this? So with that, with the attenuation of anti-communism, one of the two pillars that inform the original identity of Republic of Korea is gone. And the only one that's left is anti-Japanese nationalism. And if you look at the way things are right now, that is something that is being repeatedly emphasized whenever the issue of reconciliation with North Korea, we have the strengthening of the anti-Japanese sentiment. And in fact, we are at that stage in history right now where, because so much effort is being put into reconciliation with North Korea, despite the nuclear issues and everything, that there's almost a natural and logical intensification of anti-Japanese sentiment that is taking place in Korea. So it's this kind of very selective historical memory, and you know, just one of the things is that I argue is that, look, we demand apology from the Japanese for their past colonial period. Now, there have been horrendous things that happened during the Japanese occupation. That's, you know, that historically it's true, it's factual, we understand it. Now, but then there were other episodes in our history where other countries have done horrendous things to us too, for instance. And one example would be the Chinese, right? During the Korean War, had it not been for the Chinese intervention in October of 1950, we probably would have been united, right? But do Koreans bring that issue up with the Chinese? We don't. We don't demand apology from the Chinese. We don't demand apology from the North Koreans. But we demand apology from the Japanese. So and we have a very powerful anti-Japanese lobby in Korea, powerful anti-US American lobby, but no anti-Chinese lobby. Right? It's a very selective collective memory in operation and being utilized politically. And it's only in that particular context that I think you can understand the dynamics of this region. And I know the time is very short, and there's just too much for me to try to say it at once, but that seems to me to be one of the prime examples of how collective memory informs not just social and other issues of justice and history, but actually real foreign policy and national security policies. Let me stop there.
That's fascinating, thank you. We'll come back, I think. I'd like to ask you in a minute about how it's transmitted through the generations, but I wanted to ask Alexandra something, because I was struck a few years ago when there was a Polish foreign minister who made this statement about the problem with Europe at the moment is not that Germany is too powerful, it's that Germany is too weak. And which was, you know, for Europe was an extraordinary thing for a Polish politician to say, and it seemed to suggest that Poland had really left behind a lot of these resentments. And that was, what, 6 or 7 years ago. And now you have a Polish government that says we want to reopen the question of reparations. So it's almost like being switched on, like a sort of light being switched on. How does it come back so quickly? Or was it always there? And is it that politicians who, you know, have other reasons to fear for their popularity think, look, you know, we'll just play on emotions, you know, because that's the easiest thing for a politician to do. We won't deal with the facts of the economy, the facts of foreign policy. We'll just turn on some emotions.
Well, for sure, the Minister of Foreign Affairs has changed, right?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And the current one would claim something quite contrary to what you said. Yes, this is the question we are all asking ourselves in Poland. How could that, maybe not all of us, but part of the Polish society is asking themselves, how could that happen in such a short time? And I think that one of the explanations is that there was for sure a failure to engage in a wider discussion on social issues, but also on issues such as dealing with the past of various different segments of society. Some were left behind from this discussion, and this left a widening gap that enabled the replacement of the rational discussion based on arguments and facts with ideological disputes and emotions. And in fact, Poland nowadays worship historical figures that are actually war criminals responsible for murders of ethnic minorities. And patriotism is more and more often replaced with aggressive nationalism. I think that, that those in power, the populist powers, not only in Poland, but also in other countries of the region, are abusing also this this need of being acknowledged. And there is for sure something called the syndrome of victimhood competition present in the Polish nation, which means that we feel that Polish suffering or Eastern Central European suffering during and after Second World War has never been acknowledged in full by the West, generally speaking, and that this part of the history, the Eastern Central part of the history, has never become the part of the official identity, European identity and narrative. So that might be also one of the explanations why it was so easy to play this card by the current government.
Volker, and I really am not trying to trap you, but why did Franco-German reconciliation work? And it worked quite quickly. I mean, there were, by the early 50s, there were still problems about German rearmament, but 5 or 6 years after the war, or in fact, with the coal and steel community, within 4 or 5 years after the war, you had. Why did that work? Was it the people? Was it the leadership of the people on both sides? What?
I think there are a number of reasons. One is that if you look at cases of reconciliation the world over, you find that reconciliation works best if it's the first generation that undertakes it. That is the generation that has suffered, where the interest is greatest, or before I use the word hope, to transcend the terrible things that had happened. So there are, generally speaking, look at the Tutsi and Hutu, examples everywhere, the apartheid people. People who have undergone suffering are the ones who are first ready to try to move on to peace. Of course, that's not enough. We speak about the hereditary enemy, France and Germany, and the vice versa in France. So, and right after the First World War, it didn't go that way at all. Why was that? Here, personalities indeed make a difference. Konrad Adenauer and Ben-Gurion went ahead with German-Jewish reconciliation. Adenauer and Schumann went ahead with German-French reconciliation. Again, you needed two people on both sides, both ready and both courageous enough to say that despite everything that has happened, we must move on. Now, again, that is something that is also something that happens, generally speaking, the world over. To bury the hatchet is the same kind of thinking. When Churchill, in that speech of 1949, spoke about the oblivion being the basis for how Europe had to move on, it is the same kind of thinking. We have undergone terrible suffering, and now we need to forget. Otherwise, our society, our country, our community will not be able to live on. So the greater the suffering may be, the greater there's the opportunity to move on towards true reconciliation and to a life in peace. You mentioned your relatives. In Germany, I'm still flabbergasted to see people who were in Auschwitz or in other concentration camps who survived and who have come back to Germany after a period spent abroad, who live in Germany, who now go through schools from classroom to classroom to tell about what they experienced in the country to the grandchildren of those who were the perpetrators. What big step is that for these people? I think it can only be explained by that factor. People who realize, who have experienced the atrocity themselves, they have realized we have to move on. The whole community has to move on. And I will be part of those who help it to move on. I think these are maybe the three major factors in German-French reconciliation.
David, that's true of the Ben Gurion, Adenauer. It was in a way easier because they were so close to it, to the horrors of it.
I think, frankly, Philip, it was easier because Adenauer acknowledged the crimes of the Third Reich. Had Adenauer not done so, I don't think we would have witnessed the same history.
Yeah.
So one has to customize each situation. I defer to Volker, of course, but I would note on Franco-German cooperation after the war, number one, Germany was a defeated nation. There was no question Germany was a defeated nation. Germany was also an occupied nation. That too mattered. And if I may, at least in the three Western sectors, to the extent that one can have an enlightened occupation, it was an enlightened occupation. Thirdly, France, to its credit, tasked Robert Schuman, the foreign minister, and his trusted aide, Jean Monnet, to come up with a solution to prevent yet another Franco-German war, out of which came the coal and steel community. By the way, I would add, because the American Jewish Committee is deeply involved in the Middle East, time and again we refer to the coal and steel community as a potential model in the Eastern Mediterranean, built not around coal and steel per se, but around energy, electricity, environment, other contemporary issues, in which nations that were traditionally at odds with each other begin to see the advantages in cooperation, and ultimately the cooperation transcends the points of conflict. I think that was to some degree what explains the original six in Europe, and what we're beginning to see emerge among Cyprus, Greece, Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and perhaps one day a Palestinian state.
Okay. Sorry.
Just a brief point on that. There's also a big difference compared to after the First World
Yes.
War, in that France also was destroyed. France regained its colonial empire in name, but proved very briefly after that it was not able to hold on to it. France was destroyed. Both countries had to start from scratch, which of course made them amenable to an effort like the one they undertook. Secondly, the coal and steel community had the charm of controlling Germany even more than through occupation forces, because coal and steel is what you need if you want to build tanks or guns or whatever. And by making it the property of 6 countries, no single country would have been able to use coal and steel for their own purposes. So that was actually also an idea through which Germany could show that it honestly would not want to do ever again what it said it would not do anyway, and the others had a sort of assurance against that it didn't do.
Phil, could I?
Yeah, sure.
I know we want to go beyond France and Germany, but I want to add one other thing about enlightened leadership, because for me, this is the underlying theme of this story. Toward the end of the war, Henry Morgenthau, who was the Secretary of the Treasury in the Franklin Roosevelt administration, who was a close friend of Roosevelt, their summer homes were very close to one another, and who was Jewish. Morgenthau created what he thought was the post-war plan for Germany, which was to reduce Germany to an agrarian society, so it can never again reemerge as an industrial nation. Roosevelt, who might have been tempted at the moment by that kind of vision, nonetheless understood for a variety of reasons that that was the wrong decision to make. And he rejected Morgenthau's position. The reemergence of Germany as an industrialized power and the center of Europe would have been very different had Morgenthau's view prevailed. Again, enlightened leadership.
I mean, there were institutions involved as well. I mean, apart from the coal and steel community in the EU, you had NATO created, and in
1949.
the immortal words of its first Secretary General, who was a Brit, to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down, as it were. So there was a certain amount of reassurance. Tybor, how does the transmission mechanism through generations? Now, you know, we were talking earlier about what Korean young people think about, you know, the talks with the North, and like, I got the impression, like most young people in many places, they don't, you know, they don't engage very closely with politics, most of them, because they're listening to music or buying clothes or whatever. Are they anti-Japanese? And how is it transmitted? And has this anything to do with education? Because textbooks traditionally have played a role in perpetuating these ideas of grievances. And I have no idea about Korean textbooks, but so it's just an open question.
Sure. Before I answer that question about leadership, because you were talking about leadership, and I was thinking, okay, so who are the enlightened leaders in the Korea-Japan relations, if there were any? And it seems to me there must have been some, because we keep saying the relationships is getting worse. So there was this point at which it was better than this, and so who created that? Now, of course, and this really gets to, I think, you know, nature of politics, nature of pragmatism, and what it means to be an enlightened leader. And in the case of South Korea and Japan, it was President Park Chung-hee of South Korea and Prime Minister Kishi Nobusuke of Japan. Now, to call those two people enlightened leaders who brought these is as much to, you know, given certain political Korean political context, it's much a condemnation of them as really trying to say that they were really enlightened leaders. Now, President Park Chung-hee was gained power through a military coup. He was a graduate of Japanese military academy when Korea was still a colony of Japan. In fact, he was so good, it was at the top of his class. So when, you know, in the Japanese military academy in Manchuria, that top 5 or 6 members of each class were actually sent to the real Japanese military academy in Japan, and received extra. Anyway, so that has been his his albatross. I mean, he never got over the idea that he was somehow inclusion with the Japanese, which is why he actually he brought the South Korea-Japan normalization back in 1965, right after. Now, that particular historical moment, which South Koreans mostly remember, not so much as a major achievement in pragmatism of somehow overcoming history and reconciling with Japan, but more as a chapter of a sort of a pro-Japanese, sort of collaborator, closet collaborator, going against nationalism, nationalist sentiment, and actually affecting this reconciliation or normalization, because the moment it was announced that South Korea was actually negotiating with Japan in 1964, or January of 1965, the news came out, the whole nation rose up in massive demonstration. The students, intellectuals, all the politicians, and came out and saying that no, we will never agree to this humiliating normalization treaty. And in fact, Park Chung-hee had to declare martial law in order to push through the normalization treaty. Now, his counterpart was Kishi Nobusuke, who is, of course, what grandfather of Prime Minister Abe, and a Class A war criminal who was who was one of the people who financed the Japanese war machine during the Second World War, et cetera, et cetera. But then, for him to be able to be the champion of normalization of relations with South Korea as well. So it's not about your ideological. So what is it makes for political leaders to come up with the kind of decisions, pragmatic decisions, which look at hindsight, and it seems so incongruous or improbable, but it actually happened. And I think that's one of the very interesting chapters of Korean history. And of course, since that normalization, we have basically, Park Chung-hee said, nationalism be damned. We have to build up our economy, and so that's it's as much steel in whatever community, steel and coal and steel community. That's the beginning of the East Asian sort of economic integration, which later on added with China, et cetera. So it's a legacy that is, if you look at it from the pragmatic point of view, it's one of the most enlightened decisions. But if you look at it from a nationalist collective history point of view, it's one of the worst decisions that are still being excoriated. And how do we deal with that? That legacy is still continuing challenge to this day. Domestic textbook issues, history issues. History is, as Volker, you mentioned how malleable collective memories are. It's incredibly malleable, and one of the challenges is in this region is actually you read South Korean textbooks, North Korean textbooks, Japanese textbooks, and Chinese textbooks. You go to national history museums of these four countries. My goodness, there's nothing in common that you can find among these. There's no historical fact that we can agree upon which we can start building, maybe even if you were to try to build different interpretations, there's no common history. There were some projects back in the 1990s that were tried between Chinese, Japanese, and South Korean textbook writers, historians, but nothing really came out of it. And so each country is going their own way in terms of presenting and presenting their history to the next generation.
Okay, well, let's had some fascinating thoughts on this difficult but very important subject. Let's open it up, and the gentleman right in the front first, and we'll take two or three before you. Okay. So the gentleman right in the front here.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. I have two short questions. One is to Ham Jae-bong. I'm intrigued with the title of this session, which says collective memory or collective future. And I don't understand, or I would like to know why you use the term or, and what the nexus is between collective memory and collective future. The second question is about the very interesting discussion of the role of Adenauer and Ben-Gurion. It's not as if we did not have such leadership, or at least as a semblance of it, in between Korea and Japan. I think in late 1990s, Mr. Obuchi of Japan sort of played a little bit of, not exactly the same and not to the extent, but of Adenauer, and Kim Dae-jung sort of played the role of Ben-Gurion. He was able to do that because his own supporters were the most anti-Japanese, most supposedly progressive group.
Can I get the question, because I've got lots of people to bring in.
Yeah, the question is, in the main difference between Germany and France, or Germany and Israel on the one hand, and Korea and Japan on the other hand, is that in the case of Germany, there was the Third Reich, the Nazis and Hitler to blame. And so they are, at least for the purpose of this issue, not only defeated, but gone. And it's much easier to put all the blame on them and put the guilt on them, even though whether the Germans themselves felt guilty about what happened or not. And that is certainly not the case in Korea. Now,
Can we keep it short? Because I really do have a lot of other people, so perhaps you
I can stop here, but the question is, I think it's even easier now, after several generations, for somebody like Adenauer or Ben-Gurion to appear. But I think there are two reasons why we can be less pessimistic. One is that we have reached the nadir in our relationship, and we have no place but up than from here. The second is that I see there are intellectuals, journalists, opinion makers who are striking back, pushing back.
Okay,
now.
I'm going to go to this lady now, sorry.
And so I see some hope of the relationship getting better than worse.
The lady in the second row here. Yeah. It's okay, I can see you over there. I'm going to take some over here and then come back.
A very brief question. Thank you for a terrific panel for many reasons. This is very personally intriguing for me, but I'm going to keep it technical. We all know about Ham Jae-bong, the domestic strife about textbooks, history textbooks in Japan. Has there been a domestic strife in South Korea about history textbooks?
Okay, and there was one over there, this gentleman, and then we'll come over here in a second, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, my question is the worst case scenario, the collective obliteration of memory, when leaders agreed not to forgive but to forget. So we saw it in '65, and we saw it again in 2015 when the grandson of Kishi and the daughter of Park agreed to put again the key issue under the rug. And what could you expect but a failed agreement between the grandson of a war criminal in charge of basically of forced labor and a dictator who was in charge of implementing mass prostitution to bring currencies. So how could they both solve the comfort woman issue?
Okay. I'm going to take a few more if that's okay, and then perhaps the panelists could sort of choose ones they want to address. So this gentleman here. Yeah.
As Englishmen living in South Korea, I'm frequently struck by how very often Japan apologizes to South Korea, and how often they pay reparations. Also, how very aggressively promoted Korea continues to ask for more. So my question is not about war, nor about genocide, about colonialism, arguably a more widespread crime in the past. Should the rest of the world be perhaps looking at South Korea as an example of aggressively demanding apologies and reparations from victims of British, or Turkish, or French, or Dutch colonialism? Or is South Korea perhaps being unreasonable in the international space, constantly making these demands?
Okay. The lady just behind the gentleman.
Olga Krasniak, Yonsei University. So my question about state narrative, some of you mentioned about this. So to me, it's like two contrasting state narratives. Victim narrative on one hand, and cultivating the feel of guilt. It can be done forcefully, like Korea demands apology from Japan, or voluntarily. It's in Germany, it seems to me, embraced this sense of guilt. So do you suggest any recipe how to avoid both of these narratives, because they're not that good, definitely? And just to say, to move on, not all the time it can work, maybe like some recommendations. Thank you.
Okay, so a very good series of questions and comments there. Shall we, Alexander, do you want to, is there one that you'd like, or two that you'd like to choose to address?
Maybe on leadership, getting to this issue, because we have heard of these great leaders that enabled the reconciliation and were really so meaningful in the histories of this, of the continent, of Europe and Israel. But I think that the greatest question for now and challenge is what to do in a situation where there is an absolute lack of such leaders. And on the contrary, there are leaders who actually are motivated by nationalistic, xenophobic, even messianic thinking of their role and the role of their nations. So I would say that this is a real challenge. And again, going to the example of Poland, I was in search of such leaders in the back 20, 30 years, and there were some. But in the last few years, we found out that actually they have been replaced very quickly and eagerly by leaders that are, I would even say, obsessive with this nationalistic and xenophobic views. That's why I fear that getting back and finding the leaders of the format of the past is impossible for now. So I would.
Okay.
Thanks.
It's very interesting. Volker.
Yeah, briefly, the lady there. Narratives evolve, and they change tremendously. The German narrative about what Germany had done wrong at the time of Adenauer and Ben-Gurion is not the same at all as it is today. At that time, 44% of the Germans thought it was wrong to conclude that kind of agreement with Israel. And in the German parliament, a majority was in favor of it only because the opposition supported it. In the 1990s, the word Auschwitz never again could serve as the basis for a German decision to send German troops to the Balkans. So much had the narrative of what Germany had to do and had done changed. To the question over there, I think enforced forgetting is something that seems a comfortable instrument for many politicians who want to close a case and move on, whether to the good or for the better. Look at China, Cultural Revolution, or Tiananmen, an enforced blanket of silence over these things. But underneath the blanket, what happens turns out sometimes much later. And a question about colonialism. This is very interesting. You must have read that the Mexican president asked for an apology for the Spanish colonizing Mexico. He himself being a descendant of a colonizer, while those who stayed behind in Spain obviously were not. It's a curious view of history, but this is something that we see evolving in many countries. I don't think we can redo history over centuries and maybe millennia, but for the time being, that is something that is bound to appear in Britain too, I think in France as well, and in other colonialist countries too.
Well, yes, in Britain at the moment, the government's been considering whether to apologize for the Amritsar massacres in India. And one of the calculations they have is they apologize for this, which was by far not the worst of the many colonial massacres. Where do you stop, basically?
Exactly,
do you produce a long list, as it were, of apologies, and then do they get devalued in the process if it's a list?
So first of all, to the gentleman in the front row, yes, the Third Reich disappeared. You're right. On the other hand, there's not a single day until today where Holocaust, wartime-related issues do not appear on the agenda of the American Jewish Committee. There's not a single day. And I would and I'm speaking now about policy issues, not personal issues. I mean, take, for example, the candidacy of Kurt Waldheim in 1986 to be president of Austria after his years as the UN Secretary General, and how it completely reignited, both an Austrian, a wider European, and a global discussion about what it would mean if Kurt Waldheim, who reportedly lied about his wartime past, would become the leader of Austria. And what happened when he was elected? Other European nations largely boycotted Waldheim. He was persona non grata just about everywhere in Europe. I worry, quite honestly, because yes, as I said in the beginning, I'm a creature of memory. Memory of the war and the Holocaust is fading very rapidly. There are these surveys we've seen in both Europe and the United States that are shocking in the level of ignorance of young Germans, young Europeans, young Americans, with respect even to what the name Auschwitz signifies. And for those concerned about anti-Semitism, the fading of the Holocaust to us potentially opens a new era where the Holocaust no longer acts as a brake on anti-Semitism. Two other quick related points. For me, when I speak about enlightened leadership, I'm making a very conscious distinction between politicians and statesmen. And I think this has to be said. This is not simply a semantic difference. A politician follows. A statesman leads. I'm speaking in democratic societies. I'm not talking about populist, authoritarian figures. A politician will always think twice, do a series of focus groups, do polling in order to understand where he should try and position himself, or she, vis-a-vis the population. A statesperson leads irrespective of the political consequences. To me, people like Adenauer and Ben-Gurion, for that matter, Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, I can go down a longer list, took risks. Sadat paid with his life. but they took risks because they understood where the nation needed to go in an enlightened direction. Which brings me to my final point. This can't only be about leaders, though leaders are sine qua non. Leaders have to deepen, widen, and institutionalize the changes. What happened between Germany and Israel began with Adenauer and Ben-Gurion. But if you study the evolution over decades, literally over decades, one sister city relationship with another, Germany and Israel, one youth exchange with another, one group of young German volunteers, Action Reconciliation, traveling to Israel, one sports team after another. It widened and it deepened and it became institutionalized with the hope that it would survive Ben-Gurion, it would survive Adenauer. And in the case of Israel and Germany, remarkably it has. Largely as well because of the institutionalization of the relationship that was triggered by enlightened leaders.
Could I ask you just one question? Do you think it sends the right message when the present government in Israel has such a seemingly close relationship with Viktor Orban's government in Hungary, which at very best has been permissive of the anti-Semitism? And if you've been, I was in Hungary when they were running the campaign against George Soros, and all the old horrible tropes were disinterred. And it's sort of mystifying, really, why the present Israeli government would take such an approach.
I was wondering if I would get through one discussion without a discussion on current Middle East issues, but it's fine. I think that every nation, Philip, is driven by some combination of values and interests. This is not a new theory. This is not unique to the state of Israel. Israel is looking for friends within the European Union, and unfortunately, the countries with which it might be perhaps more aligned in other regards, countries like Sweden, Ireland, France, are rarely Israel's best friends in Brussels. I say this quite openly. They may have decent bilateral relations, but in the multilateral settings, and Israel is looking for a group of friends within. I think one needs to avoid the confusion between interest-driven relationships and values-driven relationships. Look, I will go from Israel to the United States because I began by talking about the Armenian genocide. Barack Obama in 2008, as presidential candidate, said to the American people, if I'm elected president of the United States, unlike all of my predecessors, I will acknowledge and recognize the Armenian genocide. 8 years later, it did not happen, including on the centenary in 2015, when Samantha Power, the US ambassador to the UN, who had written A Problem from Hell, her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, arguably had one of the worst days of her career because she could not express the G word. I'm not here to defend Barack Obama on this. I'm not here to defend every Israeli decision, but governments, especially smaller, beleaguered governments, have to find friends where they can, while distinguishing, I believe, between core values and more immediate interests.
Professor Hans, a question about the collective memory or collective future. I think collective memory, we were thinking in terms of how that is being used to undermine our relationship with Japan, for instance, and that there should be that we should be talking about collective future rather than just historical memory and historical issues. So that was the way we were trying to frame that, frame this debate. It's something about the. I felt you also asked about, just in that context, about Korean youth, and you asked in terms of the history textbooks, but the Korean youths are very different. I mean, they don't seem to have the strong anti-Japanese chip on their shoulders when it comes to Japan that the older generations have, you know, I guess one of the most sort of strange, incongruous phenomenon is that, of course, at the height of what we all call as the nadir of Korea-Japan relations, we have the most number of South Korean tourists visiting Japan, 7 million per year. And speaking of education, I don't know if things have really changed, but there used to be only one university that actually taught Japanese language in Korea, and that used to be Hankuk University of Foreign Language. I don't know if there's any other university that actually has a Japanese studies department in Korea. So, but you know, this is pretty amazing. This is how these things work. But as I said, the youth have, you know, as I was saying, you know, if you go to college campuses these days, all the restaurants are Japanese restaurants. There's an incredible craze about Japanese izakaya among Korean youth. And so all the signs are splashed in Japanese when nobody teaches Japanese language in Korean universities. Well, I don't know if this is the right sort of a, I mean, Korea, I mentioned this earlier, Korea-China, I always compare Korea-Japan reconciliation and Korea-China reconciliation. As I mentioned before, if we were to talk about historical memory between China, People's Republic of China and South Korea, I mean, there's so much that so many grievances on either side. And we fought in the Korean War. As I said earlier, I mean, South Koreans would blame the Chinese for having intervened and prevented national unification. I think more Chinese died in the Korean War than all the other nations that participated in the Korean War, including Mao's oldest son, Mao Anying, also died in that war. So, but when it came time for us to reconcile, normalize relations in 1992, neither side, we never brought up any of these historical issues. And we did it because we thought that's what was necessary. We don't, you know, we did something like that back in 1965 with Japan, but this thing keeps coming back, and it never seems to go away. So what I wanted to say is basically, yes, I mean, historical memory issues, these collective memory issues, history issues, they need to be remembered. We need to write history books on it, textbooks on it, but then how do we separate those issues from some of the key national security, national interest issues, such as the one we confront today? So given all the North Korean nuclear issues and other issues, what should be our relations with Japan in terms of our cold calculations of our
Surely they should be, it's obvious, isn't it? They should be very close and strong.
But it's not happening.
Which is
not happening.
Anyway, look, we've got enough to, if there are a couple of brief interventions we can take. Okay, so Jim Steinberg, and then Paul Wolfowitz, and then this chap. We're going to take those three, but very quickly, please, because we've only got a few seconds.
So I think this discussion about whether colonialism explains it is interesting, but then you have to ask yourself, what about other Japanese colonialism in East Asia, and why didn't it produce the same results? Taiwan, Indochina, and the like. And I'd be curious as whether, especially Chaebong, but others, you know, it tends to reinforce the idea that this is all instrumentalized, and that you can take the same set of events, and depending on how useful it is to contemporary purposes, either gets used or not. You don't hear these grievances about Japan in Vietnam or certainly in Taiwan. And so I'd be interested in whether how you would reconcile the difference between the continuing nurturing of this, the bad colonial experience of Japan and Korea, with the fact that other countries that experienced the Japanese Empire seem to have moved beyond it.
Okay, and then two rows back. The two gentlemen there, yeah.
Very quickly, as you say, history is always written by the winners. In the case of collective memory, what is your view about memories of plural societies where you have different communities living together? And you say it's very malleable, but malleable from whose point of view? Could I get some thoughts, please?
question is, there are many cases, Rwanda comes to mind, Spain is another one, a long list of countries, South Africa, that have had to deal with internal reconciliation. And I wonder whether there are any lessons that you've thought about that might be drawn from them with respect to this problem. And I guess a connected question is the problem with Japan, that Japan really hasn't come to terms with its own past. And you have these visits to Iwakuni that constantly stir up trouble.
Right, should we go in reverse order? Well, I don't mind going on, but technically, you've all got 1 minute.
Okay. I went to Taiwan in 1980, right after I graduated from college to learn Chinese, and immediately struck by the fact that there seemed to be very little antagonism towards Japan. And of course, Japan occupied Taiwan since what? Sino-Japanese War, 1895, right? If anything, the Taiwanese seem to be grateful for all the investment that the Japanese had made. And if there was any real antagonism, I guess if you really had to find it, it was the native Taiwanese against the Kuomintang rather than against the Japanese who had been there before and helped them. So it was such a weird, for somebody who had always been, thought that, okay, all Asians must hate the Japanese the way, Koreans hate it. It was an eye-opener. And rest of Southeast Asia, how they could have accepted all that Japanese investment all in the 1980s and sort of the flying geese model, et cetera, whereas we try to go out. Anyway, yes, that is, but it's not a widely shared thing. This is, the Korea-Japan thing is just solely Korea-Japan. We don't compare it to other issues and how other countries deal with these issues. And so it's a very narrowly focused, again, it's a very politically motivated, narrowly focused issue. Obviously, Yasukuni Shrine, it doesn't help. And I'm not trying to exonerate the Japanese on this issue. Again, atrocities have been committed, wrongs have been perpetrated. We need to deal with these issues on a continual basis, scholarship, intellectual debate, other ways to debate this. How much should we allow this to get in the way of rational calculations of national interest? That seems to me the core of the issue.
Just 2 points. I think one to Dr. Wolfowitz. To me, the best example of internal reconciliation that I can think of in recent decades is Nelson Mandela's leadership in South Africa. I think we're all quite familiar with it, but I think the key elements, at least as I understand them, are one, that he had the credibility, given his own personal experience in the ANC and then in Robben Island, to be able to create a new vision for South Africa. 2, he clearly had the courage, both moral and physical, to do so. And 3, he had the deeply held conviction about what this was all about and his vision for the new South Africa. So again, not to keep repeating, but if we're going to move forward, we need enlightened leadership. And Nelson Mandela certainly ranks very high on my list, I'm sure on the list of many here for that. On the other hand, I wish we had more time to explore the issues that Alexandra put on the table, if you will, because here you have a totally different case study that we haven't really touched upon, and that is Poland and Israel. Here are 2 countries that both legitimately lay claim to victimization by the Nazis. Israel is a Jewish state, and the Poles. And yet, thinking of Freud's The Narcissism of Small Differences, these 2 countries are constantly on the edge. And you saw with the law that Alexandra referred to last year, suddenly the Israeli foreign minister repeats what Yitzhak Shamir had said, 30 years ago, that the Poles drink anti-Semitism from their mother's milk. And here we are in 2019, Poland and Israel are purportedly strategic allies. There's a re-emerging Jewish community in Poland. And we thought we had sort of passed all this, and this brought us right back to these wounds that have not yet healed, because we're still waiting for the enlightened leadership on both sides that kind of nails this and then institutionalizes the change, deepens and broadens it so we can get beyond the differences that really should not divide two countries that both have legitimate claims vis-a-vis the war and vis-a-vis our pasts.
On Jim's question, practically all the other Asian countries and Australia, the Netherlands, Great Britain, arrived at reconciliation with Japan during the first generation, 50s. So that made things quite different. Secondly, the internal reconciliation, I think, whether it's apartheid or whether it's African-Americans and white Americans, or if it's Hutu Tutsi or whatever, the same mechanisms work as with communities that are nations, that consider themselves as countries. It all works the same way. That is why I, from the beginning, used the word community rather than country or nation. I think that's more appropriate. And lastly, one remark. If really memory is so fluid, collective memory is fluid, also history is so fluid that the moment a historical situation occurs, its authenticity already gets lost, weakens and gets lost in our minds. Then that also means, of course, that the present is never the prisoner of the past. We are free to decide what we need, what we think we need, the politics that are appropriate. We can never really have a basis for saying because this or that has happened, because you don't know what really happened. And that gives us, that gives our leaders, statesmen, whoever, the liberty to try to realize the hope that we all share. I think that is then the collective future that you put in the title here. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Two issues on reconciliation. I think that the precondition or an unnegotiable condition is, even though the past is fluid, history is fluid, and there are different pasts and different historical interpretations, but this precondition is to see our past in truth, as, again, recalling Jan Boński's words. And I think that the whole process is, of course, very difficult and engages a lot of effort that can be reversed and broken at any time. But this is like something unnegotiable, I would say. And the second thing, just to refer briefly to what Mr. Harris said about this value versus interest relations. I think it's very true, but at the same time, very disturbing. And under some circumstances, it can lead to historical revisionism even. Again, with the example of Polish and Israeli prime ministers' declaration of June 2018 that was supposed to close this dispute over the Holocaust bill, where this declaration includes historically inaccurate statements, to put it in a diplomatic manner. And I think that we really should be careful with differentiating between values and interest relations between Israel or any other countries and countries such as Hungary under Orban or Poland under Kaczynski. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I let you go, I just wanted to, there's one reconciliation which hasn't been mentioned in Europe, which has, I think, some lessons, which is the reconciliation in Northern Ireland, which is both, Paul Wolf has explained, an internal reconciliation and an external one, because it reset the relationship between Britain and the Republic of Ireland. And it seemed to me that the two really important things in that settlement were, one, that the Republic of Ireland had become confident and successful enough within the European Union to stop seeing itself purely in terms of victimhood. I mean, until the 1990, I'm half Irish, so I understand this, that, you know, Ireland had seen itself as purely as a victim. It gained the confidence to see itself as a proper state. And the willingness of two British governments, a Conservative and a Labour one, to say we're going to leave behind, you know, all the old sort of unionist sort of flag waving that we used to indulge in, and actually say the future of Northern Ireland is for the people and we're not going to stand in the way. And I think that was a very good example of how confidence on both sides worked. But the main thing is to say thank you to our panel for a really interesting, thoughtful, fascinating discussion, which could have gone on for a lot longer. So thank you.
Thank you.